Hello, and thank you everyone for making the time to attend Kyantis webinar, DCT is not the goal, just the means. Joining us to present will be Medical Director Estelle Hanel and Grace Gartel, Clinical Operations Project Manager. Don't forget to visit our website, kyantis.com. The webinar will begin in just a few minutes. Before the presentation starts, however, a few housekeeping items. By default, your microphones will be muted for the duration of the presentation. We are going to keep this webinar to about 45 minutes. If you have any questions, please use the questions section of the platform control panel that should be up on your screen to enter them. If there is time at the end, we will be answering questions. If we don't get to your question, don't worry. We will answer all questions via email within a few days' time. I see a few more people logging in here, so I'm just going to pause for a few seconds before we get started. Okay, great. Even though some people are still logging in, we will get started. Hopefully everyone will be on the call by the time the content starts. Again, my name is Jillian Stamatis. I will be moderating this webinar. Welcome to DCT is not the goal, just the means. Estelle and Grace, if you would take the discussion, that would be great.
Thanks, Jillian.
Thank you, Jillian. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Estelle Hanel. I am the Medical Director at Kyantis. Very happy to be with you today. And to start this presentation with my colleague Grace Gartel. We would like to be coming back to, the very reasons of why we are starting to hear so much about DCTs and implementing potentially DCTs. So let's go back to why they are really necessary. And with very concrete examples from our experience, Grace and I are going to be proposing to identify what can be the risks, what can be the areas where we need to be very cautious when implementing DCTs, and what we can do actually to mitigate those risks and make them be successful clinical trials.
Okay,
before we start,
we're going to start off with our first poll for Jillian.
So we want to hear from you what, from your point of view, is actually a decentralized clinical trial. So from these different definitions, there's been so much in the literature. We are happy to see what is your view actually of what it means. And it will allow us to know you a little bit better. So if you want to pick. One of those. And probably in a few seconds, we are going to be looking at the results.
It looks like we have about 80% of the answers. So if the rest of you can submit your vote, then we can discuss. All right, Estelle, go ahead.
Excellent, thanks you for responding. So interesting to see that most of you actually think it is all of the above. So interesting results. Maybe we can go to the next poll then and see, after understanding what you see is a DCT, maybe we can see if you have ever implemented either a fully decentralized clinical trial or a hybrid clinical trial. Every clinical trial with a DCT component would be considered as a yes, I have. Maybe you have not, but you're planning to do so in the next year or so. maybe you have not, and you have no plans to do so thus far. So we're going to know you even a little better.
Thanks, everyone, and we'll give you a few more seconds to submit your vote.
And so let's see. Okay, so the good news is that none of you have not done and no plans to do so thus far. So you are either already experienced with DCTs or implementing DCT components for 43%, or you have not, but you're planning to do so for 57%. So great results. It's great because then you're going to probably understand when we speak through those risks and mitigations, and it's probably going to be generating some discussions. Thanks for answering these polls. So we want to come back to why they are necessary. So we are absolutely convinced they are, but I think it's always important to come back to the very reason of why we do things. So we are convinced that they help, and they help in many ways. They help first by decreasing the patient's burden. This issue is very well known, very well described in the literature, and we all know the patient's burden can sit in many aspects. It can sit in the travel that can be necessary for patients to travel to the sites. We have seen this in the NIH oncology trials here as an example, where patients were required to travel 40 miles to study site. You know, and this burden can sit in the volume of the procedures, in the size of the readings for the patients that they have to digest and understand. We think that DCT components can help reduce this burden. Of course, the travel, of course, the reading can happen from home through these different components that DCT offer. They will help increasing enrollment and retention. Indeed, those figures are probably not new to you. This has been the everlasting problem of clinical trials. Procedures such as e-consent, such as televisit, you know, will help feel the patients they are more inclined to contribute in clinical research, that enrolling is not going to be making their life as complicated as expected, and it's probably and likely that DCT components will help increase the retention rates and the compliance rates. Last but not least, we are convinced that DCTs are there also to help expanding access and diversity in clinical trials. This is also being very, very problematic. There are loads of information about that as well. I chose here one of these compelling examples in a study where African Americans comprised for less than 5% of the participants in trials that were run for 24 oncology drugs that have been approved by the FDA in 3 years. And worse than that, these included trials that were targeting cancers disproportionately affecting African Americans. So all of us here in the clinical trials industry, we can't bear those figures. We can't leave this, you know, for longer. So we are convinced that DCTs will not only offer clinical trial access to those patient population who would benefit actually from these treatments, but it will also help include more diverse patient population, and so that will allow making sure that the drugs are actually studied in the patient population, who will then be more reflecting the real world situations when the drug is in the end marketed. So that's really very important aspects of DCTs that we wanted to start with. Any further details, Grace, on this?
Absolutely. So research census data in the United States has shown that despite ongoing efforts to increase the amount of minority groups that do enroll and participate in clinical trials, populations in trials still do not look like the US population. And as you can see here, only 1% of cancer patients in clinical trials are Hispanic, compared to 17% of the US population. A little less than 3% are Asian American Pacific Islander, compared to 7% of Americans. And as Estelle already mentioned, 5% African American, compared to 13% of the US population. And non-Hispanic Caucasians are overwhelmingly overrepresented in research. And this is a problem because when we look at the results of clinical trials, we need them to be generalizable to the population that was studied. And so using DCT strategies actually provides an opportunity, we believe, to increase the generalizability of your research results.
Absolutely, and it's interesting to see that more and more the legislation, the regulators are also looking at this. So you probably all know, how the FDA and the EMA recently put more focus in patient-centric research. There is, of course, the FDA PFDD initiative. But on top of this, they really start to be looking in more details as to how to regulate and support the utilization of DCT components, being convinced of how this is going to help. So there are a few examples. We're not going through all this today, but I have put it here, 2 examples. One of is the FDA-sponsored CTTI initiative, which recently published recommendations for conducting DCTs. So I encourage you to look at this, and amongst a few other ones, I picked the recent FDA guidance on DHTs for remote data acquisition in clinical investigations, which starts to put some concrete elements of how to incorporate DCT components into your trial. And again, this is, I think, because really the regulators now start to also accompany this, more and more present conviction that this is going to help, particularly decreasing the burden of patients during clinical trials. So from there, it's great that we see these, but we can't be naive and thinking that there won't be any challenges. So great.
So the next question that we come to is, despite all of these excellent reasons for implementing DCTs, and despite the fact that regulatory agencies globally are starting to look towards DCTs as the clinical trial practice of the future, how can we avoid the most common pitfalls when we implement them and mitigate the risks that are inherently involved? And so that is what the next portion of our presentation today will discuss, starting with our first point, avoiding data loss when patients do not come to site. So the first thing that we want to keep in mind is flexibility. DCT components need to be able to collect the data that's required by the protocol, but the technology all by itself is not a solution. Not all DCT components or strategies will be right for every trial, and when designing your study, it's very important to think about your particular protocol's needs when choosing what options to implement. So here are some of the technology offers that are available, and it's important in every unique case to choose the right solution for you, whether that's bring your own device or provision devices available from a vendor, whether that's remote enrollment versus enrollment when a patient comes to site, whether that's a combination of televisits or on-site visits. What kind of reminders and alarms need to be available for participants who are not coming to site and may need to be reminded to perform their trial activities. Backup solutions, what is available in case your primary option is not functioning as expected, and how to collect data, online only mode versus offline. Another key point when thinking about implementing these solutions is that the aim is simplicity. Multiple technologies and options should not mean adding more complexity to the trial. The aim of DCT is to reduce the burden on patients and sites, and that means that the technology must be simple and easy to use, or you are missing the point entirely. And then additionally, these are some of the options that is important to consider because data management is done not on site and not in person. You need to think about how you are going to make it simple for the participant to enroll and participate in your trial. And it's also important to think about the sites too, how they are going to access their data and monitor for completion. Additionally, because the data collection is not done in person, data management and audit trails become the key way to ensure that high quality data is collected. Some key points to consider are what edit checks are put in place and how the data management and cleaning is going to be performed throughout the study, as well as the documentation, key study roles, and if implementing televisits, how you are going to collect the date, time, and who has connected for the visit session, because you need to mimic the function of an on-site visit and protect the patient's privacy. So our next point would be managing the protocol complexity, taking a closer look at a couple of patient populations where, due to the nature of the population, conducting clinical trials has become increasingly complex, and how DCTs could play a role in managing those inherent complexities. Firstly, let's take a look at oncology research. Since the year 2000, the number of procedures that participants must undergo while participating in an oncology trial has steadily increased. And in partnership with that, the average duration of an oncology trial in 2018 was 3.2 years, which is over 40% longer than the duration of all other therapy area trials. So you're expecting these patients to do more procedures for a longer time. And this has resulted in a complexity rising to 22%, mainly driven by the increases in the number of endpoints and increasingly specific eligibility criteria, which has driven also an increase in cost, estimated to reach $68.9 billion US per year by the year 2025.
Absolutely, those figures are a little frightening, Grace. And so how do we deal with that? I mean, this is not really something that is a sustainable situation, right? And when we look at the actual impact of this in your clinical trial operations, you know, this is where you really are going to see the problems. When you want to implement some digital components, and when you particularly want to build an ecosystem to collect endpoints from the patients digitally, you will see all these complexities linked specific of oncology being very prominent. A complex study design in oncology means that you're going to have numerous questionnaires, you're going to have multiple arms, multiple triggers, and this is going to be really having a direct impact on how complex the study setup is going to be. Oncology is also very specific in the way that amendments are more frequent than in other therapeutic areas. You often have study extension. You can often decide to have an additional visit because there is a new endpoint to add, because there is a safety signal or whatever. This is often generating complexity and anxiety at the study level. So we have to understand that. And as you were saying, Grace, the studies are longer. They are longer than across every other therapeutic areas. This long study duration can affect the engagement of the patients and can affect also the engagement of the sites and their organization. When the site staff is changing because the study is lasting for years, this generates complexity. So how do we mitigate all this? And how do we make those oncology clinical trials not become a nightmare? We, from our experience, are really looking at these specific complexities and trying to propose specific solutions that are going to be making this not to be so much of a nightmare. It's very important to work with experienced teams. They analyze the protocol, they analyze the pain points, they understand from the very beginning actually what are going to be the areas of risks. For example, something we do is that we, with the experienced teams, have understood that planning from the very beginning to add extra visits in the build of the ECOA is going to help. If from the get-go these additional visits are there, then at the time of the amendment, the situation is much easier, the anxiety is lower. We also have strong processes and robust data management. And why is it key here? Because the data cleaning and exports are going to be timely, but you also need to have agile teams because when studies are long, your study implementation and your sites closure are going to be staggered. The sites some sites may exhaust their pool of patients, while some others will just barely start recruiting patients. And so you need to be managing the site closure in a staggered way for a more successful end of trial. Another thing we do is make sure we have study activity reminders and a large flexible set of data collection modes. It's very important to remember that not all the patients are preferring the same way, the same things, and they're not all behaving the same way. In our experience in the last years, the oncology studies we supported, the patients were extremely ill. They were undergoing multiple procedures. So we are making sure that the solutions work in a device agnostic manner and that we can implement that flexibility to make sure that patients, whoever they are, whatever their state of health, can complete their duties in the protocol. What we also do is of course, make a televisit possible so that, again, the patient's comfort is improved, compliance can be improved accordingly. And in the end, we always propose a set of backup solutions, again, here in that same spirit of flexibility, making sure there can be one or another or both, if needed, backup solutions implemented to maximize data entry, whatever the situation, whatever happens with the oncology protocol. So we have, Grace, I think, another area where we have identified complexity that is worth being looked at.
Yes, exactly. Another population that we have inherent challenges is research involving children. In the years 2008 to 2010, the number of pediatric clinical trials registered on clinicaltrials.gov was slightly over 7,000. And in the period 2017 to 2019, that raised to over 11,000, nearly 12. But despite that increase in pediatric-specific research, 11% of pediatric studies still end prematurely, largely due to lack of recruitment and failing to meet the enrollment goal. And even in studies that do manage to recruit and continue through to completion, up to 42% of those studies failed to gain FDA approval for the pediatric indication that they were attempting to gain. And this is a problem not only because it means that the contribution and time of all of those children who did participate did not contribute to meaningful change in the medical landscape, but also because it is an extremely large waste of resources and funding. A lot of research has been done on understanding why parents do not consent to enroll their children in research. Obviously, not all of these things can be solved by decentralized trials. However, we genuinely believe that for a large number of these, DCTs can lower the barriers to access.
Absolutely, Grace. We don't think all of these barriers would be solved by DCTs. There are so many, and some are so specific to, pediatric populations. But we think that some of these barriers can be leveraged by DCT solutions, such as allowing local physicians to participate in research, for instance, which is making the study easier from a logistics standpoint for the patients. Parents and children can also have more information now that they can consult and review from the comfort of their home, thanks to training portal media players that they can use from their provision device or from their own device. So this is making also their life easier. The fact that they can go to more familiar offices if a local lab is used for protocol procedures, or even if a mobile nurse, can be sent to the family home. This makes the trial participation much less frightening, much more affordable from a logistics standpoint. The televisits, of course, will allow the patients and their parents to be in direct contact as often as needed with their doctors from home, which allows not only to replace some of the visits on site, but also to have, just a chat to see how it goes. It will easily replace what used to happen on the phone, and it will make it much more human, especially for these populations actually, which are digital native. And so we know how our children have no problem with using these digital tools. So that is some areas that can be helped. And we have actually, let's say, tried to consult our convictions on what patients prefer, or to challenge a little bit those, with creating a user test with children at Scientist, where we asked children to complete some questionnaires, which were either standard questionnaires or questionnaires with illustrations. And we have actually asked these children who were aged from 5 or 6 through 15 to complete them on different devices. It could be web, tablet, or smartphone. And it was it has comforted our conviction that they are extremely agile on any type of device. And we also noticed through this test that the potential for illustrations is very strong. It has value in pediatric research. 60% of the children said that it has helped better understanding the questions, and I think also they found it, a little more fancy, and it can probably, it has potential for increasing compliance. Televisit as well, actually, as we were saying, as this is, very well, how to say that, this is very well the way now they connect with their children, and they also have done this during the lockdown for school. So this is very natural to them.
Okay, and then the last area that we wanted to address today We'll cover the challenges that come with adding new technologies into research in order to support the DCT model. Firstly, we want to remind everyone the importance of adopting a user-oriented approach when building your solutions. It's important to involve the end user in the development of the specific tools that will be used, as different populations will have different needs, and those needs can evolve over the course of a trial, especially if you are looking at one that is lasting for many years. And how can we do this? We need to work with patients and develop their trust as well as the trust of sites, and help all of the end users perceive the trial as a single stream as opposed to multiple different activities or sections that they need to connect to or work with. The end users need to feel confident that our technology works and does not hinder them, or they won't use it. But that being said, when we speak to patients, they have a clear preference about the way that they would like to engage with clinical trials. Estelle, would you like to share a bit more?
Yes, absolutely, Grace. So we, as you were saying, need to work with patients, definitely. So we have also run another study with a lot of patients across Europe and the US in order to better understand how they perceive clinical trials, what is their experience with clinical trials, and what has been their experience with utilization of digital tools or of DCT components. And interestingly, those patients, when we asked them if they had a say in the way their next clinical trial would be run, only 11% of this huge population told us that they would stick to a traditional site-based clinical study, meaning that almost 90% of these patients are ready to run a partially remote trial, a hybrid trial, or a fully decentralized clinical trial. This study was run actually at the end of 2020, beginning of 2021. So this was in the middle of the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic has catalyzed the utilization of digital tools. And probably the results wouldn't have been the same, a year or two before. But it's really important to see that the patients themselves, the one having experience in clinical trial, are the ones saying that they prefer now running DCTs because they know how it can help reduce the burden of the clinical trial that they have experienced.
Okay, and then how to enact this in practice? We need to also plan for appropriate training and support for the users that will be involved in interacting with the technologies. Firstly, that means ensuring that any material that end users and especially patients need to access is adapted to that specific population, whether that's to use a specific education level or reading level, whether that's to ensure that the patient's preferred languages are available and accessible in the technology, especially considering in the United States that the average reading level is approximately that of a 6th grade person, which is a 13-year-old. It's very important to ensure that you are avoiding over-technical or jargony language and making sure that the users are comfortable and can understand all of the material that they are engaging with. Additionally, it's important to ensure that there are numerous and repeatable training opportunities, that users should be able to go back and revisit any training materials wherever and whenever they wish to ensure that they are comfortable and confident when using the technology. And lastly, ease of access is paramount. It should not be complicated or time-consuming for users to access the tools that are meant to help and support them as they participate in the trial. Lastly, we wanted to touch on data privacy and protection because this can be a major barrier to the adoption of technology and research. It's important to make adjustments based off of regional or country-based specifics as well as patient preferences. This includes being flexible and using different technologies in different locations based on their needs. For example, if one was implementing a study using bring your own device, it may not be possible to perform that in China because their local rules do not allow for App Store or Google Store app access. And so it may be possible to perform BYOD in Europe, United States, and some parts of Asia, but other parts may require provisioned devices. So implementing a hybrid solution where certain countries do not use BYOD or where patients are able to choose for themselves whether they like to use a provisioned device versus their own personal device. And also thinking about online data collection in case of using BYOD because that prevents the need to store potentially sensitive health information on a patient's personal device, which may not have the same level of security guaranteed as a provisioned device would have. And lastly, ensuring that you have backup options, both via web or interview modes, so that in case a personal device is lost or damaged, you still don't lose the opportunity to collect the data. And one thing to think about is that about 20% of the US population still does not have regular access to broadband internet or use of a smartphone. So we need to still consider those people who may be left behind if we fully transition to using only technologies.
Absolutely. Thank you, Grace, for these considerations. So we now reach the time for sharing some conclusions. So what we want you to take home with is going to be that decentralized clinical trials are there to help, really to help, but that we need to keep in mind that the ultimate goal is to make the sites and the patient's life easier. That's really what they should be, what DCTs should be. And when you think of implementing some DCT components, there will be technology, but we as clinical trial stakeholders shouldn't be seeing DCTs as implementing technology only for the technology and trying it and playing with it. We need to be thinking solution. The technology always goes with all what's surrounding it that makes the solution work. I mean the training material, I mean the support, the help desk, I mean all the alerts and the reminders that are going to go, because they are going to be helping the patient remind all what they have to do. So we need to think of all the solution that goes and not only the tool for the tool. And while you think of implementing a DCT component in your trial, always keep in mind that you will need to be ensuring data quality and integrity, protecting data privacy, as Grace was mentioning, and that it's going to have to be making a difference in the patient burden. And the advice I would give you now is that if one of these conditions cannot be met, just don't do it. Maybe it's not the right protocol. Maybe it's not the right DCT component you wanted to test. Maybe we need to be reflecting, to be envisioning alternatives. Maybe it's a hybrid clinical trial I need to try. Maybe we need to be creating checklists with making sure we identify the risks, the mitigation, what are the areas I can try and put a DCT component versus others, And so let's remember that it's always allowed to try. there are opportunities for trying it. A solution can be tried on an exploratory endpoint, for instance, that wouldn't put the study in jeopardy. The hybrid trials, as I was mentioning, are always have alternatives in place. They are set, they're ready from the get-go to make sure the data is going to be continuously collected, whatever happens. We spoke about flexibility, multiple options, and backups are guaranteeing that data collection is always feasible. As far as ECOA is concerned, of course, the user acceptance testings are there to test multiple scenarios, and the flexibility and the experience of your partners are going to be here beside you to make the right choices and pick the right DCT component to try for the right protocol.
So given that trying is the mindset that we would like you to leave this 45 minutes with, I'd like to invite you all to answer our final polling question. What do you think, following our discussion today, will you now try and integrate a DCT component in your next clinical trial? I'm seeing these answers come in very rapidly. Thank you. I'm glad that you were all still awake and paying attention. I think we have about 75% of you having answered, so we'll leave it for another second or two before we share the results. Okay, I think we can safely close the poll. And I am pleased to see that so many of you are feeling excited and looking to the future about DCTs. This is the same feeling that we have, and we are glad to share it with you.
Very glad to see that 89% of you are ready. So hope these messages have been helpful. And I think we have time for a few questions.
Yes, thank you. That was a lot of great information. Just an aside, as mentioned, a recording of this webinar will be sent to everyone, but we do have a few questions. The first question is, what about mental health conditions? Could we have caregivers doing the technology needed at home?
Absolutely. Mental health and other therapeutic areas. This is also the case with pediatric, actually, where we have caregivers. So every type of DCT component has to be thought of being able to be used either directly by the patient or by the caregiver. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Another great question, for home visits, how can we ensure safety of the healthcare professionals making those visits?
Estelle, as a healthcare professional, I think that you probably have a more nuanced view on this point. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so what's the question? Just want to make sure I heard it correctly, Jillian.
For home visits, how can we ensure safety of the healthcare professionals making those visits?
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question. I think for home visits, the safety of the healthcare professionals probably needs to be addressed through proper training, first, of their behavior. You know, how do they need to be behaving when they're at the family's home. So I guess these are going to be responsibilities of the sites or of the organizations who are actually providing the home nursing services. That would be probably my understanding of how it works.
Yes, I would agree, and I would also like to just add on that in the vein of decentralized trials, and the possibility of moving towards a more televisit-based scenario as opposed to sending traveling nurses or research employees to the homes of the patients, that you have the opportunity to hold the visits via teleconference and have, for a large number of indications and procedures, the same experience as if a research doctor or nurse was present in your home without actually having to have that person travel to you, and that eliminates some of those safety concerns.
Great.
Absolutely.
Thank you both for those in-depth answers. We do have a few more questions, but unfortunately we are out of time. We will answer all questions via email in the coming days. Don't forget to be on the lookout for the link to this webinar in an email tomorrow. And again, don't forget to visit our website, cantis.com. Of course, I'll invite you to follow us on our LinkedIn channel. And thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.